Thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks so much for offering to do this interview. As a first question, could you please introduce yourself and explain your work and also the impact that you're trying to have through this work?
Yes, sure. First of all, thank you so much, ICLEI Africa, for the invite. It's a great opportunity to be here. My name is Priscilla Negreiros, so I'm the manager of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, working at Climate Policy Initiative. So first, Climate Policy Initiative is an analytical and advisory organization that focuses on policy and finance. So we help governance, business, and financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. So our vision is to build a sustainable, resilient, and inclusive global economy. So at CPI, as I mentioned, manage the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, which is a coalition of leaders that is committed to mobilize finance for city-level climate action at scale by 2030. So the Alliance serves as this multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for urban and subnational climate projects and infrastructure worldwide. So we have around 60 members, and they represent both supply and demand sides. So from what we call the supply, public and private financial institutions, governments, and international organizations, and what we call the demand, so the city and subnational networks. So answering your question on the impact, we are very much committed to make the Alliance this main platform for cooperation, partnership, and advocacy in the field of subnational climate finance, which is a very niche and important field for cities. And for that, we want to enable our members and the organizations that are working with us to work better and more effectively together. So we aim with that to mobilize more finance to city level.
So from your experience, what do you see as some of the critical barriers and opportunities to financing more sustainable and climate resilient infrastructure in African cities?
So globally, around 2.5 to 3 billion people are expected to move from rural to urban areas by 2050. And there is a high need for climate resilient infrastructure to support this shift and population growth in general. So this is especially the case in Africa, where its population of now around 1.1 billion will likely double by 2050. And more than 80% of that increase will occur in cities, especially slums. So a very important point is that 2/3 of the urban space that Africa will have in 2050 does not exist, and so must be built during the next 35 years. And for that, given the crucial role the cities will play in Africa and already play, there is a central need to respond to challenges faced in having access to finance to build all this infrastructure that is needed. I'll mention 4 main barriers to unlock finance. I know it's up to 3, but they are interlinked. The first would be on municipal budgets. So municipal governments are unlikely to finance the large green infrastructure gap themselves due to budget restriction and sometimes high levels of debt. Especially in cities in emerging economies and developing countries, many cities lack of resources to fund basic service, and therefore leaving little room to cover upfront costs of infrastructure and the additional cost to make infrastructure climate smart. So this can be very, very significant, and a lot of the cities depend on transfer and funding from national governments, which leave them with not a lot of room to invest in sustainable and climate resilient infrastructure. So this will be the first main challenge that we know a lot of cities face. The second one is trying to look for this finance outside their own budgets and maybe outside national government budgets. There is a general lack of creditworthiness. So, which I mean is the likelihood that a city will be able to respond to a credit obligation. So the World Bank, and this is a very interesting number, like it indicates that in developing countries, only 4% of the 500 largest cities are creditworthy in international capital markets, and only 20% in local capital markets. So over half of the countries forbid their local governments from having any kind of borrowing, which is another point that it's increases this lack of creditworthiness, including even taxation authority. So as a result, cities are restricted in raising a sufficient amount of capital to finance their projects. So this would be my second main barrier. As a consequence, also, we have a lack of investor-ready bankable projects. So let's say that the city is creditworthy, it's able to borrow money in international or public or private markets, but sometimes it doesn't have the project ready and bankable, having a sufficient size or quality. So cities are often unaware of investors' needs, and the investors' need change from investor to investor. So many cities lack of this detailed reporting on financial and sustainability components of projects, which is a requirement for many investors to make investments related decisions. And finally, based on that, and I will raise this as more of an opportunity than only a barrier, like there is a need for project preparation in cities. So municipalities lack of this capacity to prepare infrastructure projects, and while various project support facilities have been developed over the years, there's still a large need for this type of support. So to have better projects and a ready-to-go pipeline. So this is also like a challenge, a barrier, but it's also a great opportunity. We see a lot of different organizations within the City's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. We even have a group that is called the Project Preparation Facility Group, where we try to bring all of those project preparations together to work better and to improve the assessment and the project preparation system that they're giving to cities. And this is a central place for opportunity and a topic that would help a lot African cities in tackling all the challenges that I mentioned.
Thank you for reflecting on that. It comes across that many of the barriers and some of the opportunities you've identified, there are small actions, but a lot of them require systemic change. The COVID pandemic has pointed to also a broader need for systemic change and has actually created some of its own systemic shocks in the system. How do you see the COVID-19 pandemic impacting on these barriers and opportunities?
Yes, sure. Like cities in particular, and I'm not telling anything new here, have been hit hard by the pandemic and will face challenges as they cope with the fallout from COVID-19 and begin the recovery process for sure. So the pandemic is a wake-up call that our cities must be better prepared for the climate crisis too. So before discussing a bit on the challenges and how COVID will increase them, like the negative effects of climate change will lead to catastrophic and are already leading to catastrophic consequence for cities, and is therefore it's imperative to address both crises with more determination. So we must not allow one crisis to exacerbate the other. In terms of the impact that COVID-19 will have on this barriers, I think the first one, if I mention again, municipal budgets and creditworthiness, is basically that COVID is likely to have a significant fiscal and budgetary impact in cities. They are spending more on social protection. They are losing substantial revenues from locally generated sources. So this can impact essential infrastructure and service providers, such as mobility, housing, water, and sanitation. So at the same time, they are relying more in intergovernmental transfers and making cuts, putting them in a difficult situation. So definitely thinking more on the long term, COVID could bring additional barriers in those two topics. But on the other side, like the increase, we see that COVID increases even more the need for project preparation and bankable projects ready to go. So cities now more than ever need to be able to diversify their funding sources and have more access to public and private investment. For that, they urgently need project preparation, bankable projects, and ready to invest. And this, again, is a challenge, but it could be also an opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the need for fast and to work together, and the sense of urgency and collective reaction might give us some lessons on tackling climate change, and this could definitely be a step forward for cities.
The points you've raised are incredibly important in terms of also the anticipated large-scale kind of recovery funds coming in, both in terms of own national funds, but also the intergovernmental, or rather the multilateral funds coming in. And then, you know, cities are being asked, okay, where are the projects that we can fund, that we can include as part of what we would call a green recovery to the pandemic. And cities are unfortunately not always actually ready with that list. And so there's also a time pressure related to the response, which is very interesting to consider and offers a definite need to pause and reflect on how cities can be ready for larger flows of funds coming in. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. From your perspective, how do you believe improved multi-level governance can be an enabler to increase access to finance for subnational governments?
So yes, improved multi-level governance is key to ensuring access to climate finance for cities. So a lot of cities depend on their national or subnational governments to have access to public fundings, and sometimes even private funding. So their ability to access climate finance at a broader scale also frequently depends on national government. So one example is multilateral development banks. If not all of them, most of them, while investing in urban climate smart infrastructure, must first go through national governments, or often they need sovereign guarantees before implementing a loan. So this means that well-managed multi-level governance is key for cities to have access to finance. So to create an improved multi-level governance that can assist to attract more climate finance for cities, each player has its role. So for cities, we know that they must work on their creditworthiness and make sure that they have climate action plans in place and they are following national climate priorities. So this would be very helpful to improve multi-governance. And national governments clearly must prioritize climate action and low carbon climate resilient infrastructure at the city level, creating this enabling environment that can support cities in accessing climate finance, and they have to facilitate the access to climate funds. So on the example I mentioned previously, so providing both financial and technical capacity support for cities. A recent report from the Coalition of Urban Transition has even published that implementing low carbon measure in cities by national governments would be worth almost 24 trillion by 2050. And this could reduce emissions from cities by 90%. So basically, there are a lot of opportunities in this field, and improving this governance is a key area to start this work.
That statistic alone is really interesting in terms of the need. It really highlights the need to prioritize climate action at the national level and the importance of maintaining the momentum towards COP26, where national governments will both represent their increased ambition through their updated NDCs. And when we consider the role and activities of other actors, such as institutional investors, private sector banks, as you mentioned, multilateral development banks, what would you say are the actions that they need to take in order to improve the flow of finance for climate action to subnational governments?
First, we must make cities a priority. So, and that for that to happen, we need to build awareness of city finance needs. We need to have national governments and institutional investors, donors, elevating commitments and amplifying the actions towards cities. And of course, have private financial sector, the private financial sector, supporting new and scaling existing investment solutions that can fill crucial gaps in cities' climate finance. So including both existing best practices and new innovations in financing policy. So this is actually key actions that these actors must take. And finally, we should aim to support cities to also help themselves. I think this is it's a very important point. So the goal for a developing country city should be to plan and finance necessary investments through a combination, let's say, of their own resources, national government funding, and finance raised on the market with support, but not 100% dependent on the assistance of developing partners. So I agree with you. I think a lot of the role of the alliance is putting those actors together to make their work better and try to bring on and find solutions to some of the points I raised.
Thanks, Priscilla. I really appreciate your time and those insights.